everyone back connected. So can someone who's connected to a browser just see... Hold on, I just have to jump to another computer, just a sec. Bogman, can you go to the live stream on your computer and just check that it's running?
I can go on my phone.
Okay, if you're not getting the console, I think you can go to Okay, this is a bit of a problem. We've got the wrong link now. So the stream is running and we're live.
In the comments of the old stream that there's a new stream link.
The old stream is now not visible on my YouTube, unfortunately. Yeah, because I think it was once the server crashed. Now I'm getting a lot of messages. Hold on. I just need to get a link. Okay, we're going to be running late. I'm really sorry about this, everyone.
I can see the old stream. It says, Eder, I can see the old stream. It says, looking for a game to capture.
Yes, I know.
It says, chat is disabled.
If you go to my channel...
You can't enable the chat, can you?
Sorry. Just going to check that. I mean, we have a stream up and running. It's usually got a 30-second delay, and people have found it, they're watching it, so I might just give it 10 minutes for things to reconnect.
This is schizophrenic. There's two Peters.
I would disconnect and reconnect.
I mean,
Stop it.
We have a stream up and running. It's usually got a 30-second delay. We have people have found it, they're watching it, so I might just give it 10 minutes for things to reconnect. Okay, so for anybody who's tuned in, we just had a bit of a technical issue with the live stream, so I'm glad that you found the link. And I'm just going to... We had about 25 people waiting, so we've got... Okay, the original link doesn't seem to bring us here. Okay, thanks. I'm just going to go into the YouTube chat, everyone, just a sec. Okay, so the original link to the seminar doesn't bring us here. Try to put this link in the description of the original if it's still there. Yeah, thanks, Kieran. I will try to do that. Just a second. Okay, everyone who's on the Discord, I'm just going to put this message in the Discord general. So that's the new link. And we will... If people could share that in useful places. Can you post this to my Facebook and event on everywhere? Post it there, find it at everything. Okay, well, it looks like most of our audience has found the stream again. So once again, I'm sorry that we're running 4 minutes late at the moment. I'm just going to wait another 2 or 3 minutes and we'll get started. Now, for our speakers on the Discord, does anybody have any issues with connecting, or are we all good?
All good.
All good.
Okay, it looks like Espen is not connected to Gary's mod. Is everybody else okay? Okay, great. Okay, so while we set up, I'll just get our speakers stand back up. And for all of those who are watching, thank you for your patience. This is the first time we've done this, so there are a few growing pains, it would seem, such as us crashing the server in our testing phase and therefore crashing the YouTube stream, so it would seem. But, okay, we move on. Now, as I've sort of been told by anyone who does this sort of thing, the first time you try it is usually moderately chaotic and terrible, and hopefully by the second or third time things settle down a little bit. So I want to thank all of the people who are in the server right now for coming in for session number 1. And I've prepared a little sort of 5-minute spiel of what the event is and why we're doing it, and hopefully give you some idea of what I'm trying to achieve over these 4 seminars. So welcome everyone to Mod Theory 2020. My name's Peter Nelson, and this is sort of the first 100% online version of Mod Theory, which is like a game studies conference, or a group play date. And hopefully the raw material that we get from these live sessions can be something valuable that I hope to transform into some short game studies videos. And for everybody who found us on the live stream, our speakers and special guests are all here with us on this Gary's Mod server, and they're already destroying the stage. And so tonight we have speakers Olli Leino, Eder Jørgensen, Sebastian Moring, and Trevor Strunk, as well as I think some of our speakers from the other sessions later in the week have joined us, and a couple of special guests. But before I introduce the speakers, and while we let the live stream technical issues settle down, I'd like to say a few words about what this project is and why I'm doing it. So a few years ago, I became really obsessed with the situationist architect and artist Constant Neuenhuis. Mackenzie Walk, in the book The Beach Beneath the Street, gives a really excellent description of Constant, this artist and architect, as the true outlier in the otherwise slacker culture of situationism in the 1950s and 60s. Constant was the situationist who seemed to actually get things done. And his major project was this architectural utopia called New Babylon. And New Babylon was a new city that was built for a new type of humanity, a life where all work had been automated and all material and individualistic ambitions had evaporated, leaving behind a society based purely around play and improvisation. The architecture of this city that he wanted to build, New Babylon, was designed to stimulate the senses stimulate the senses in a post-work world. And outside this world, outside this giant megastructure, the idea was that the rest of the architectural world would be left behind. And inside the megastructure of New Babylon was this modular architecture that would continually rebuild itself, rearrange itself, as I'm rearranging myself here, and continually force people to sort of creatively readjust. And for people inside New Babylon, the idea of an artwork or being an artist would make absolutely no sense. It would be the equivalent of, for them, a tax return or being an accountant, because in this post-work world, improvising and playing, expressing oneself and making new configurations, which would then be, broken apart and reabsorbed back into the megastructure, that was all that was left for New Babylon. And when I was, spending more time on art and architecture, I was very interested in this sort of sandbox vision of society. And when I found Gary's mod, which is the venue that we're using for this conference, I realized that it represented quite a profound creative statement. You know, here was a 3D virtual environment left over from this kind of monster slaying game of Half-Life 2 and transformed into something that for me is like it's like a 3D Photoshop or something. Where, you know, for us in this game right now, the greatest challenge is confronting your own creative desires. You know, we're faced in this sandbox where, just to mess with you, I'm going to clean up the server. We're faced with this sandbox where we don't really know what to do, and we have to continually make it up. So like New Babylon, these Gary's mod servers will continually get cleaned out and we start again. But I guess as 2020 is making painfully clear, we don't all live in a world of free play. When our jobs are cancelled, we see the acceleration of the economic pressures that have been building around us for years. And in this way, Gary's mod seems to be sort of, it's not New Babylon, it's like this phantom of New Babylon, a rubble of secondhand toys and a lot of copyright infringement that nevertheless confronts us with the creative sublime of what should we do next. Once the first person shooter game is over and we can rearrange the game into whatever we like, there's this interesting moment of what should we do. So over the next 4 seminars of Mod Theory 2020, I've invited speakers to talk on 4 different topics using Gary's mod as the venue, as the conference venue. And to take advantage of the setting, I have suggested that while our speakers are presenting, they probably won't be able to do whatever they're doing right now, and they'll probably be sort of reading out their speeches. And I want the rest of the people on the server to think how you can use Gary's mod to respond to what's being spoken about. Perhaps the equivalent of the improvised play of a New Babylonian, or maybe just the scribbling in the margins of a good daydreamer. I've tried not to put too many limits on what players can do in the server tonight. My only advice is that, and this is for all of the players, that you be respectful, whatever that means, and that you challenge yourself to understand each talk on a deeper level through the gameplay. And hopefully we can sort of feed this back in through questions. And after every talk, I'm going to have a look at the YouTube comments and see what questions have popped up. So that's definitely enough speaking for me. What I'd like to do now is pass things over to our first speaker, which is going to be Olli Leino. And tonight we're talking about the meaning of game objects. So once the game has ended and the adventure is over, what do all these objects actually mean? So we've got a lovely speaker's podium here. And Olli, I'd like to invite you to take the podium and start the first presentation.
Thank you, Peter. Do you all hear me all right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, we hear you fine.
Can you see me doing the motions on the stage?
You're waving.
Yes. Who knocked over my
All
chair?
Right. Good evening, everyone, or whatever time it is where you are. My name is Olli. I'm affiliated at School of Creative Media at City University of Hong Kong. My research addresses computer games as objects of experience, object of interpretation and emotion. I'm interested in computer games as presenting themselves for us to interpret, either as players or as members of audience watching a gameplay performance. I draw on phenomenology and existentialism and philosophy of technology. And today I thought I'd talk a little about the existential weight of game objects. Or in other words, about game objects through the idea of computer games as worlds in which we exist. So what makes computer game objects what they are? How and why do they appear meaningful to players? And furthermore, is comparative game ontology possible? When we talk about objects across games, I thought this would be a relevant question for this particular environment we are in now. I'll start with the proposition that it's still somewhat experimental. Computer games have a dual nature, and this dual nature is sometimes approximated as the distinction between the interface and the world. And objects straddle both sides of this distinction. What I mean is that on the one hand, we can consider computer games as constituting game worlds in which we can exist alongside objects, exist possibly also alongside each other. And on the other hand, computer games also constitute the modes in which we experience these worlds and the objects and events they contain. So in other words, computer games are responsible for both the game world and our ways of being in those worlds. Computer games give us not only objects of perception and experience, but also the modes of perceiving and experiencing the objects they contain. As I suggested before, this duality pivots around game objects. And talking about game objects necessitates taking into account the being in the game world, to borrow a term from Bella and Gualeni's recent book. The being in the game world of the player who is involved with these objects. And I'm going to spend the remainder of this talk on explaining what I mean with this statement. Some parallels here. When we talk about ordinary objects in the so-called real world, our conversations are made possible by all of us sharing, to a meaningful extent, the same embodied human condition of a Homo sapiens on the third rock from the sun. Talking about experiences with ordinary objects like carrots, it is necessary to acknowledge, of course, that we are all situated and embodied differently. We have different facticities. Someone may like carrots very much, while someone else might be allergic to them. But nevertheless, if I say that carrots are healthy, I don't have to preface this discussion with the description of that which governs carrots or our relations to them. I don't have to talk about laws of gravity and thermodynamics, principles of carbon-based life forms, and the specifics of our mortal human existence in this world. Like Daft Punk sings in the namesake song for their third album, Human After All, from 2005, I quote, "We are human after all, much in common after all." End of quote. In computer games, though, the situation is slightly different, and this makes it challenging to talk about computer game objects, especially across different game worlds. What makes game objects what they are and shapes our relations to them cannot be so easily bracketed or fast-tracked, like in the case of ordinary objects like the carrots in the real world. So to make sense of computer game objects, we have to explicate their existential weight. To get into this, I'll start with an example that you might be familiar with. The Japanese action puzzle game Katamari Damacy for PlayStation 2 from 2004, in which the player is to roll a ball, a katamari, and grow it as large as possible by rolling it over things. Everything smaller than the ball adheres to it, but trying to catch something larger than your ball damages your ball. There's a lot of game objects in this game. Levels start really small and then scale up. For example, you might begin on the tabletop collecting things like paper clips. Then you progress to the floor, collecting furniture. Then outdoors, houses, apartment blocks, highway bridges, and so on. All the objects are individuated. As we roll over things, the game tells us what we have just collected. A mandarin, a horseshoe crab, cassette tape, milk candy, mahjong tile, dog food bowl, watering can, wooden bench, laundry pole, police bike, lion statue, 3 ladies in waiting, supermarket, coral island, railroad bridge, and so on. So while the diversity among the objects in Katamari Damacy is rich and wonderful, unfortunately the objects serve no other purpose than being collected, and their individual identities are not really that important. Another game you might know, in which a diverse range of object is at the foreground, is the casual puzzle game Little Alchemy from 2013, where the player's task is to combine icons representing objects, concepts, substances, elements, items for short, in order to create new items. Husky, for example, is created by combining ice and dog. Valid combinations result in a new item appearing in the inventory, which is then waiting to be combined with something else. There are over 500 different items for the player to discover. For example, air, volcano, life, motorcycle, sheet music, and solar system. There is no time limit and no punishment for trying out a wrong combination. So I've mentioned a few game objects. It's time to get to the question of what are they? What do they mean? Where does their significance come from? And what is this existential weight? What is the baggage we have to deal with when talking about them? Well, in Little Alchemy, the items have no uses other than being combined with specific other items. Not all of the created items actually can be further combined. Husky, for example, is at the end of the road. Sadly, we can't make puppies by combining two huskies, which would be great though. Furthermore, there is no overarching logic to the combinations in Little Alchemy. To borrow a concept from Veli-Matti Karhulahti, the game is an unsolvable riddle. It is exemplifying someone's idea about objects and their relations. It's all about second-guessing the designer's choices. In fact, the objects in Little Alchemy do not offer much traction for being theorized as game objects, at least computer game objects. They are like jigsaw puzzle pieces which have a predefined place in the idiosyncratic solution. To make sense of them, we just need to see the solution. That solution is available online if you're interested. Maybe someone can share that in the stream comments on YouTube. In Katamari Damacy, then, objects also have limited purposes. They serve no other purpose than being collected. The objects are just fodder for growing the ball. Achievements are available though. Those who collect all the individual kinds of objects can get an achievement, but that's optional, as achievements often. But there is a time limit to each level, and it's possible to fail as a player of Katamari if one can't find the right size object to be stuck on the ball. And this is where things begin to get interesting. We note that Katamari gives us the freedom to roam around the levels, rolling the ball and admiring the landscape, being amused about the different kinds of objects there are. But this freedom is not limitless, and rolling the ball around is not just a leisurely activity like walking in a walking simulator. Katamari Damacy resists our attempts of roaming around. The gameplay condition in Katamari Damacy is so that we can enjoy this freedom only as long as we keep growing the ball. Should we stop growing the ball, then we are thrown out of the game. This lends significance to the game objects as follows. There are no different kinds of objects. There are simply differently sized objects. Individuation beyond size is voluntary. Denying the identities of individual objects in Katamari Damacy would simply make one not get the achievement. But denying the importance of size of objects would make one a non-player. The kind of objects in Katamari Damacy is deniable, but their size is undeniable. So, storm clouds, fat schoolboys, panda balloons, and dried kelp, some objects in Katamari Damacy. How do we get at what do they mean? We note that Katamari Damacy presents us these objects as situated within an instrumental rational ontology. Within this instrumental rational ontology, the objects appear as coefficients of utility and adversity in relation to our project of existing in Katamari Damacy. If we have a ball sized about 5.5 meters, then the dried kelp at about 5 meters and the fat schoolboy at 1 meter 85 centimeters are coefficients of utility. We can catch them and thus keep death at bay. However, the panda balloon at almost 17 meters and the storm cloud at the whopping 309 meters are coefficients of adversity. Trying to catch them would damage our ball, bringing death closer. Katamari Damacy gives us a simple example for talking about how game objects appear as significant, as there is no uses for the objects beyond being collected, and no individuation beyond size. I have two slightly more complicated examples. We can consider a game with a crafting system like DayZ. We find that also in DayZ there is a gameplay condition lending significance to objects, which appear within an instrumental rational ontology. In DayZ, the player is free to roam in an open world landscape, as long as they survive the encounters with zombies and other players without getting cold and hungry and thirsty. For making this happen, finding objects and making new objects out of them plays an important role. One of the items you might find in DayZ is a wooden stick, or actually wooden sticks, which may at first seem like a trivial good-for-nothing object, but turns out to be critical to one's continued survival. To survive in DayZ, one needs to carry a lot of things: food and water, weapons, ammunition, clothes, whatnot. For this, a bag of some kind would be very useful. Should you happen to find some rope and a burlap sack, you can make an improvised courier bag with 12 item slots. Now, if you didn't throw away the wooden sticks from earlier, you can combine them with your improvised courier bag, and now you have an improvised backpack. So what's a wooden stick in DayZ? What makes it meaningful? Like the combinations in Little Alchemy, also the combination of wooden stick plus improvised courier bag in DayZ is predefined. Knowing this, however, does not exhaust the meaning of the wooden stick. Unlike the items in Little Alchemy, the backpack can be used. It lets us carry 12 items, significantly more than just a courier bag or a child's school bag, for example. The existential weight of the wooden stick is somewhere along this instrumental rationality, which leads to enhancing our chances of survival by letting us carry 20 items at a time. Whereas the wooden stick in DayZ enabled new ways of doing things, in other games there are other objects which are involved in the ways of perceiving the game world. Consider the HEV suit in Half-Life. Without wearing the suit, the interface the player sees is very minimal. But finding the HEV suit object and putting it on, the health meter and a host of other information appears on the screen. You'd be more careful around barnacles when you know that you only have 3% health left. Another example, a flashbang grenade in Far Cry. Makes the player of Far Cry deaf and blind upon explosion. It is not just an object to be perceived, but an object involved in the modes of perception specific to the world of Far Cry. Alright, I mentioned before that it is easy to talk about ordinary objects in the world, as we can fast-track their ontological and epistemological origins, because we share a human condition. We face similar difficulties in existing in this world. We know that carrots are healthy, but if you eat too many of them in one go, you might get sick. Not stick, but sick. As functioning adults, we have some sort of intersubjective understanding of the existential weight of many root vegetables, including carrots. For the dried kelp and the fat schoolboy, the wooden stick and the burlap sack, the HEV suit and the flashbang grenade, we don't have an intersubjective baseline by default. Knowing what those objects are requires knowing how they appear within instrumental rational ontologies against the gameplay condition in their respective games. Right, so I'm in a position to conclude soon. Back to my questions. What makes game objects what they are? How and why do they appear as meaningful to their players? Simply because they have existential weight. While some of them might as well be left alone, the deniable things, others, the undeniable, are waiting to be discovered sooner or later as coefficients of utility or coefficients of adversity. When we get involved with them, they might transform our ways of being in the game worlds. Furthermore, when we express ourselves in games, when we take on personal projects, when we attempt self-realization in games, the existential weight of the game object is at our disposal. Then, as for the other question, how do we talk about objects across games? In this light, comparative game ontology, or comparative ontology of game objects, on any significant level of detail, would be a vast project, to say the least. Cataloging different objects from different games would be totally meaningless without documenting also the existential weight these objects have in the worlds in which they originate. So the scope of work for comparative game ontology reminds me of a cryptozoologist seeking to understand the chupacabra. The cryptozoologist needs to reference not only the creature's physical appearance, but also the context in the folklore in which the creature is situated. In other words, perhaps I would like to end on the idea of each game object being like the asteroid Oumuamua, the interstellar messenger. Thank you for your attention. Now you can shoot the speaker.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for that, Olli. I'm just going to turn my volume settings back up. And thanks for all the comments in the chat about my loud keyboard sounds and mouse clicking. As I said, first time, so thank you for putting up with all the errors. Okay, so thanks so much for that presentation, Olli. What I thought we might do is take questions after the next talk, because Olli's talk and Eder's talk are kind of linked and follow one after one another, and then we'll get on to Sebastian and Trevor. So I'll just do a quick server cleanup. There we are. And I'll bring the speaker podium back, and I'd like to invite Eder Jørgensen to come to the stage. Here's our new stage. And Eder, take it away. Eder, we can't hear you, so maybe...
Yes, no,
yes.
Sorry, I just had to approach the stage and turn on my mic at the same time. Sorry.
Okay, no problem. All right. Yes, we
you
can
hear me?
Yes, we can hear you perfectly well.
Thank you. So, hi everybody, and thank you for letting me participate in this exciting seminar. So, my name is Eder Jørgensen, and I'm a PhD fellow at the Center for Computer Games Research at ICU, and games as representations. So my talk today will focus on the ontology of games as representations, and it will be based on a chapter from my recent PhD dissertation. I won't have time to go into all the details about the full argument, so if you are interested in that, you might at some point in an unknown future read it there. So my talk will be concerned with the question of what representation is and what it means to say that game objects are representations. I'm motivated by an ambiguous status that I think representations are often given in game studies. Espen Aarseth has proposed a general model of games according to which the game consists of a representational layer and a mechanical layer. The representational layer is a surface expression of games, and it's the sole means by which players can interact with it. This, of course, suggests that representation is a crucial element in our engagement. Often the mechanical layer might then be considered underlying this surface expression, which may of course suggest a second. However, this layer may also become conceived as an underlying or hidden, that through careful excavation can be unearthed. This is also suggested, I think, in the proposal of the seminar topic, in which we are asked to reflect on the tension between representation, that is what games look like, and ontology, that is what they are revealed through play. What this proposal also suggests is that there is a tendency to privilege particularly pictorial modes of representation. So my topic today will be slightly different. I will revise this challenge of the proposal and discuss the tension between the game as a model and the game as material. In my talk, I will sketch out a view of games as models that is inspired by the philosopher Nelson Goodman's nominalist account of representation that emphasizes the role of culture and practice. To say that games are models should hopefully not be very controversial, since in game studies, games are often simulations. So I will discuss what a model is and what relation it has, and the material object constituting the model, and why I think it makes sense to treat games as. Having done this, I will then open a discussion about the role of the materiality of games in regards to the inferences we can draw from the model as material object And finally, I will reflect a bit upon the implications of this view to the challenge posed in the introduction of today's. So my starting point is this. Several scholars treat games. Gonzalo Frasca, for example, subscribes to this view, and to simulate is to model a source system through a different, which maintains to somebody some of the behaviors of the original system. So while this definition is elegantly simple, it also poses some problems. If to simulate is to model, what is to model then? There are also other problems with the notion of simulation. Some of these problems relate to the ontology of simulation, and some to the ontology of the targets of the simulation. The former issue questions whether we should think of simulations as representations of, or rather as a different ontological category of the phenomena themselves, virtual. Similarly, Orsted argues that we should distinguish between representations that merely show or describes how would bad, and simulations that actually reproduces a functioning example of this object. In regards to the issues pertaining to the target of the simulation, the central, which kinds of targets simulations might have. Veli-Matti Cartolazzi, for example, argues that the concept of simulation is actually not very fit, since simulations are a type of imitating system that require a target that has an empirical extent, whereas many games simulate fantastic phenomena such as dragons. However, I would argue that such fantastic phenomena are relatively unproblematically treated in what we might call a cultural. So this suggests that scientific representations are not only different in regards to the context in which they appear, but also the mechanics by which they. Related to this, David Myers observes that simulations must point to something else outside of, whereas games are self-referential. He therefore argues that the concept of simulation is not really able to the kinds of referencing that goes on. Not unlike Orsted, Cartolazzi proposes the label virtuality rather than simulation as a descriptor of what game. However, this just adds a novel term without really explaining the fundamental underlying or the fundamental question underlying both the problems of with the simulations I have sketched out before. So the fundamental question that we need to examine is how simulations represent. So what does it mean to say that something simulates another, and what characterizes the relation between the simulation and the object it represents? So luckily, the philosophy of science may provide us with some answers. So in the following, I will build upon a nominalist view of models and scientific representation, which I borrow from philosophers Catherine Elgin, Roman Frick, and Jørgensen. So if we look at both Frasca and Orsted's arguments, simulations are closely connected to or changes in their targets over time. What distinguishes simulations from representations is, in short, that simulations are dynamic and capable of representing the behavior of an object. Game doors can be opened or closed, unlike the text in Orsted's example, and game pipes can mix in Frasca's. As such, Frasca and Orsted follows a tendency we can find among many game scholars of privileging certain aspects of action to Galloway, processes to Murray. However, while the dynamic aspects of games is definitely important, games are also many other things. Instead, I suggest that we consider behavior only one out of many potential properties that we might want to represent an object, rather than giving behavior any privileged status. In order to emphasize this lack of hierarchy among properties, I suggest the notion of model rather than simulation, simply because simulations are used about dynamic models. A model can then represent a number of different properties, both those that are sometimes deemed intrinsic, such as, for example, material, and those that are called, this could be, for example, spatial and temporal location. So still we are left with the question of how models represent that. Typically, we might say that models are structurally similar or homomorphic to that. But what does this mean? In regard to similarity, the philosopher Nelson Goodman long ago observed that this is neither a sufficient nor necessary condition of representation. Since objects can have an almost infinite number of potential properties, everything will be similar in some way. In addition to this, objects do not appear to us nakedly, but are always given a form that depends on our needs and judgment. Phenomenologists may call this intentionality, and cultural theorists may call it. In a similar way, Roman Fricke, a philosopher of science who have worked extensively on scientific simulations, the notion of homomorphism, pointing out that the model is only similar to its target relative to its. In Fricke's view, models are mental objects constituted by this. Building on Goodman, Fricke then suggests denotation as a general principle of scientific representation as well. And I believe a related view should be considered for games. This is in many ways a liberating view, as it does not hinge upon an empirical reality with an observable and knowable, but also allows us to represent hypotheses about the world, idealized, and even phenomena that we know for a fact are untrue, but that might still be used as a convenient step to arrive at other truths about the world. Fricke therefore argues that models are imagined objects dependent on a description. And to understand this difference between a model and a description, consider a tabletop role-playing game. In such a game, we may find a variety of model descriptions, and they could be the rules, character sheets, and character drawings, and the notes of the. Based on these descriptions, players can then form a map in their heads. According to Fricke, there are no material requirements of model description, which can be communicated in a variety of ways. And however, materiality does play a role. Fricke and James Nguyen have developed a view of material models that they call representation. This idea is inspired by Goodman, who have theorized representation as exemplification plus denotation. Exemplification is a secondary form of reference to denotation and works in an opposite direction. So I may point to an object in a game and say, this is a. And by doing this, the object comes to exemplify that are denoted by the label door. However, the object may also exemplify a variety of other labels, such as the label game asset, or label pointing to various properties related to the object, such as different. The important thing is that the object in itself may always possess more properties than what is exemplified in a given situation. To Goodman, then, representation acts when we use an object to denote a different thing and then impute on this phenomenon the labels that the object exemplifies. This is, for example, common in caricature, but also in simulation. According to Fricke and Nguyen's view, a material object constituting a model come with a number of properties, some of which we may say exemplifies properties in the model properties and target properties do not need to be added. So the central thing is that they come with a key of how model properties should be translated into target. The same thing we may see in games where represented phenomena may in different ways be exemplified by properties of the material artifact. I will return to this in a bit. This view solves some of the issues we may have with games. First of all, it allows for a generous view of what can be simulated. That is, not only phenomena that have an observable and empirical extension, but also the fantastic phenomena that Orsted and Carolati. But it may also make it possible to think about games as simulations of, for example, cultural concepts. An example that I've been concerned with is gender. And gender is a concept that many theorists argue is primarily constituted by culture. But what then is the structure of gender and how can it be imitated? I believe that gender would be very difficult to simulate if we hold that simulations are strictly imitating systems. Similarly, even though the material objects constituting Orsed's virtual doors and may be highly different, as models, their main difference are which that are included in a model and which are excluded. And there will always be properties that are excluded. Finally, this view allows simulations to be multi-stable. Their meanings can change. A model may denote its target based on conventional or even normative practices that we internalize to the degree that they become natural. But a model may also denote its target based on ad hoc stimuli. To understand how game models may represent in a given context, it might be worth examining Goodman's idea about needs and judgments that I talked about earlier. So what are the needs we are faced with? These may of course be varied and depend on the particular purposes and aims of our, which may vary from player to player. However, as Leino have pointed out, not all things in games are negotiable. The gameplay condition imposes upon us certain characteristics that are undeniable. Here, the material object as representations as becomes important. If we return to the virtual door and the texture door, the material object matters. If I pass by a door in a game without the need to use, I may say that both the virtual door and the texture door object represents a door as, for example, solid and impact, and as a frame plane with a knob. However, if I'm surrounded by enemy characters that shoots at me and the only escape route is through this door, it of course makes quite if the game represents doors as a solid plane that can be opened, passed through, and closed. However, of course, depends on the particular needs of the. Similarly, we're used to thinking about phenomena such as health, strength, etc., as being represented in games in numerical points, health bars. However, we may ask ourselves what properties of these concepts, these target concepts, are included or not included in such conventional ways of representing them. Similarly, if I'm used to considering game doors as something that I should be able to open or close, a texture door may not actually qualify for a door. What is important is the distinction between the material object and the model, which makes it possible for games to and the player to make wrong inferences about the game. Furthermore, since a material object will always possess more properties than is exemplified in a given model, they are flexible and have the potential to model a variety. Some resting on the mere gesture of denotation, whereas others function in some way or another as representations. As representations, these models may not only allow us to come to know whatever type they may have, it also allows us to draw inferences about the material object with which the player. As Leino have once pointed out, we can approach the material artifact of the game from an experiential first-person perspective, as well as from the perspective of the expert or behaviorist who, based on her observations of the object, about the regularities and patterns in the behavior. So, to conclude, let me return to the assumed tension between representation and ontology. I would say that the texture doors and the virtual doors are groups of particular objects that may possess quite different material qualities. However, neither are necessarily doors, and both could nevertheless exemplify things that we may attribute with a label. Being a door is only one out of the many labels we may put on. So as I see it, we have a tendency to conflate the material object, and we may say that doors in games are not representations but actual doors, although slightly different from the doors that surround us in physical space, because they correspond roughly to our prejudice about and to the need that a door must fulfill in a given context of the game. But what happens to the doors in Garry's mod that are stripped of the needs with which we may have approached them in the source game? What are we to make of a vehicle if I can freely roam around in the game world? Seized of their previous purpose, these objects questions both the utilitaristic and normative ways with which we often approach models in games, and open themselves up to new representational and to the plurality of meanings we can attribute. Thank you.
Unmute myself again. Thank you so much, Eder. That was super nice. I'm just going to have a quick look over on the YouTube comments to see if we've had any questions so far. We have a 30-second delay, so if anybody has any questions, it is really best to put them in the YouTube comments. Otherwise, by the time, and put them in the comments in advance. Otherwise, by the time we get them, we might have moved on. So thank you so much, Olli and Eder, for those first two presentations. I guess the intention in these presentations was, whilst we face this kind of slightly creative anarchy, but also a degree of boredom in working out what to do next in the game, I was really interested to hear these quite focused and in-depth discussions on what sort of flexibility there are in these game objects. As you see with us sort of stuffing around, we're really getting to the point of just playing with the affordances of the Valve Source engine, which is what Gary Newman, who put together Gary's mod so brilliantly, really, I guess, worked out how to do. Was, at what point can things of the engine be changed, and can those changes become features of the game, such as adding in functional doors versus static doors, changing the textures on objects, but in many cases not changing sort of other effects. A wooden door still seems to be a wooden door, even though it now looks like a circuit board, and a metal door will be coded as a metal door, even though it has its representation visually being completely changed. Okay, so I can't see any questions in the YouTube stream so far. So because we started a little bit late, maybe we'll just keep the show rolling. And we're going to move on to our final two speakers. We have Sebastian Moring and Trevor Strunk. So for Sebastian, I guess I should also do a server cleanup.
Can I do a brief check? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can hear you perfectly well. Okay, so Sebastian, I'll give you a speaker's podium to sit on. Oh, hold on, maybe we can get it a little bit straighter. There you are. Okay, and are you happy with that chair, Sebastian? Is the office chair okay? Or would okay, sure. All right, well, take it away, Sebastian. And yeah, please, if there are any questions, please leave them in the YouTube chat. And also, because this is the first stream we've done like this, if there are any technical issues like my clacking keyboard or sound levels too low, let us know and we'll address them as soon as we can. Okay, so without further ado, Sebastian Moring, you're up.
Thanks a lot for having me. Thanks a lot, everybody, for participating in the seminar. I'm Sebastian Moring. I'm an assistant professor in European Media Studies at the University of Potsdam and University of Applied Sciences, Potsdam. And today for this seminar, I was thinking I'm trying something new. It turns out extremely tentative and a bit fragmentary, and therefore open to criticism and suggestions. It will be. Originally, this talk is actually a result from dealing with the lockdown during COVID-19 in Germany. And I was playing No Man's Sky. So while being in a mod, I'm speaking about No Man's Sky. The original title was supposed to be is Time, but maybe now I call it Economy of No Man's Sky, on how to never be free from repetitive games. So let me start. Over the course of the last decade, a number of so-called sandbox games featuring activities such as mining, crafting, farming, and harvesting became tremendously popular. Elements of this genre, games such as Minecraft, No Man's Sky, or the educational game Eco. Sandbox games are similar to open world games in that both genres are usually praised to offer players a lot of freedom in terms of choice they can do in-game when. Sandbox games differ from open world games in that in the former players can potentially modify the layout of means of mining and building structures. Players of open world games cannot change the layout of the game. They can choose more or less freely where to move. This amount of freedom, sandbox games come with the promise that all players, or that players will be able to realize themselves as players of those games. And they only keep accomplishing missions. The thought which Olli Leino pointed out in 20 regard to the free-to-play title. However, this also counts for the mentioned sandbox game. They entail a promise of freedom and happiness, which may be reached as a result of playing them. Playing a sandbox game like No Man's Sky, you will come to realize that in order to move towards kind of freedom, has a certain amount of experience measured in terms of in-game currency, knowledge measured in terms of prints, other structures which allow to install different automated machines in order to other resources and materials, and which allow to do a different travel. All this requires for players to find, craft, harvest, and accomplish a lot of missions. Most players know that these activities can be quite tedious in-game. They may even be experienced as draining as work. Activities in games which require a lot of, I quote, performing repetitive tasks, usually for gameplay advantage or good, in order to gather experience points or to improve a character's level, end, are hence called grinding. There is, however, a significant difference in how this grinding is experienced for a player of No Man's Sky compared to the physical work, which is simulated. When mining in No Man's Sky, as a player, I do not feel the weight lifting heavy objects, and I do not feel any aching pain of bodily work performed over a long period of time. It's really wearing on players. The amount of time it takes to perform all these activities in order to reach self-realization. Here I'm actually referring to the actual existential weight, which is the existential weight of the player and not of the game. For instance, even worse, the moment players seem to reach their goal of self-realization, it retreats again. In 2016, Olli Leino and I have argued that the structure is characteristic of games being shaped by neoliberal logic. So today, trying to make sense of this experience, the question is, how can I make sense of finding activity in terms of its technology and in terms of how players perceive it? In other words, what is this grinding activity and how is it experienced? My hypothesis is that the nature of grinding in No Man's Sky consists of repetitive passing of time. To argue for this, we'll first describe the No Man's Sky game a little bit, and I will explain how I understand time in the context of No Man's Sky resource. Thereafter, I will point out the paradox that No Man's Sky always implies some sort of manual labor, even though it is played on a computer, which is a tool extent. The automation of labor and efficiency. Before I will come to some preliminary conclusion, I will take a look into automation in games and its meaning with regard to No Man's Sky. So let me first describe some of the gameplay in No Man's Sky in order to contextualize the meaning of grinding in the game. The game starts with dropping the player avatar on some random, that is procedurally generated planet with its specific ecosystem. It has its own climate, resources, flora and fauna, etc. At the beginning, players may get the impression that the game is set on one single planet, which may be due to the fact that a single planet can be of such a size that it would take hours, days, even weeks to move the player figure without the help of the vehicle around. The impression can only be overcome by repairing the player's spaceship. This will allow leaving the planet and space. It means to explore other star systems and eventually other galaxies. However, until players reach this phase, they will have to mine a number of resources, such as minerals, in order to repair the launch thruster, for instance, or the pulse engine. In addition, they will have to repair the scanner and the analysis visor of their multi-tool, such as elementary mining operations. They will also have to constantly charge their tools as well as their life support and their hazard protection in order to have the player figure survive and to continue their quest for freedom, self-realization. It's clear before players are able to get into space, they will have to perform a significant amount of craft. This obviously takes a lot of time. Speaking about time in such a way, this means to time considered like a commodity or a resource. which is primarily enforced by management theorists such as Peter Drucker. Time is a unique resource. Other than money or people, both can somehow be obtained. Quote again, one cannot rent, hire, buy, or otherwise obtain more time. Time is plastic. Perspective, one may say that grinding consumes a significant of the game time a player of No Man's Sky may have at their disposal. This is a different understanding of time as a resource than that described by Zagal, Fernandez Vara, and Mateus in 2008. That time is a resource determined by the game, thing which players have left in order to accomplish a certain task. On the contrary, the kind of time to grind is taken from a player's real-world resource, gaming time. It goes at the expense of the real-world. That's the reason why this grinding activity is coming to the fore in a player's perception in terms of the time it consumes, because it is tying into a real resource a player may have in a given game. Thinking about this, it appears paradox that grinding activities take so much time considering No Man's Sky is played on a computer. Actual work in the process of grinding is not performed by the player, it is performed by the computer processor, mainboard, memory, storage, etc., which are changing a game state from mining one resource to storing it in game inventory. Paradoxically, devices do not need nowhere nearly as much time to calculate the outcome of related grinding activities, the time it takes as a player to mine resources. No man. Mining the resource carbon, for instance, I need in order to my mining tool, simple and totally non-exhausting, using a button on the game controller to mining tool, directing it at some point object, the game environment which hosts that resource, the mining beam, and waiting for the process. Since I'm mining my basic, not yet upgraded mining tool, all I do is invest time, wait for the process to be finished. Physical work, the actual grind, is done by computer. Contrary to human beings, do not complain when performing the same operation over and over again. It's their true nature to repeat the same operation indefinitely, switched off. Of the reason why they became popular devices in an economy built on a. According to theorist Wendy Chum, the introduction of a powerful popularized the promise of change. It appears that grinding activities in No Man's Sky are not stimulated by means of the corporeality which they involve, by means of the time activities take physically by human beings. This is why this kind of labor, to modify Quigley's popular notion from 2005, perceived as draining as physical work, perhaps as draining as cognitive work. It's usually perceived in terms of the time spent in front of it. For instance, when waiting for a loading bar to fill up, waiting for all Zoom conference participants to connect, when measuring the time it takes to do a workshop presentation. For the player, the meaning of the mining tool consists of how much time it requires to mine a needed resource compared to other faster or slower mining tools. It goes for spaceships, other kinds of structures and devices. Things like mining tool, which is faster than use less time to find something, and that's the meaning. Describing the experience of No Man's Sky as a form of grinding implies highlight their repetitive mechanicality and machine-like quality. Perhaps in order to prevent players from losing interest in boredom of repetitiveness, slow games, the developer of No Man's Sky enabled players to build structures, allowing them to mine the farming of resources. Shout out to Sonja Fizek, who's working in it would allow players more time to other things while these simulated machines do the work for them. It seems this is a step toward player freedom seemingly can reach the goal of self-realization. Innovation in No Man's Sky thus producing more resources eventually allows to obtain larger structures, travel large distances. In a sense, though, similar to cultural history, this allowed the phenomenon to be scaled on a different level. Instead of making factory workers due to the production of machines and computers produced a kind of worker. Physical work consists of picking, typing, pointing, waiting. Relation. Of needing to grind every resource myself with my grinding tool, I still, if I have automated these, still need to travel to the automated factories, wait until they are done and to collect the resource. The characteristic of the player's grind is not even changed. It's automation. It's a similar cycle. Players are not mining and harvesting the environment, but from machines which they have built. This cycle of reminiscent mine which is popularized on t-shirts of many cryptocurrency mining. At some point, though, players may eventually have obtained nearly all kinds of vehicles, buildings, and so on. Oh, why are you only saying it now that I'm not? Is it still bad? Okay, I will just continue.
Yeah, sorry, Sebastian. I think the issue is probably to do with connectivity speed at your end. So I'd continue, and I think what we might do when I edit the videos for upload is we might do a pre-record of some of the audio just to make sure it's delivered to the standard at which you prepared it. But yes, keep going. And
right, let me just finish. I'm almost done. I'm sorry that that's what happens if you do something. So, at some point, though, players may eventually have obtained nearly all kinds of vehicles, buildings, and so on. It seems it is possible to escape this cycle, to reach self-realization and freedom from the grind of No Man's Sky. Times of software as a service, though, as soon as a player may have managed to make this projection of their future self a reality in the present, Hello Games introduces new ways of playing the game by adding new features, such as living ships or exomags. Those new vehicles equal new opportunities to invest large amounts of time in the game in order to perform more repetitive tasks. And freedom in No Man's Sky seems to be unmasked as an illusion forever. So what to conclude from this? Just described repetitiveness of playing No Man's Sky just be the same repetitiveness which is characteristic for a concept of play as suggested by Walter Benjamin. This perspective would allow to say that if playing No Man's Sky appears repetitive to a player, then they are probably just playing and everything is fine. Looking at the concept of grinding, though, it appears that playing No Man's Sky creates time-managing subjects. Players are doing while waiting is work of a computer, even though they are just initiating a given task at hand and the computer is executing. The moments of idle time when the computer is moving a player's spaceship to the next planet and when it is executing a mining task. During this time, players as subjects of neoliberal societies will take to strategize and to calculate. Calculate, for instance, the amounts of time, different strategies of mining, buying, traveling, constructing, and waiting to get to a certain place in the game world or to obtain a certain vehicle. Since they are calculating repeatedly and the whole time. Again, players end up doing what the computer should be. They're behaving like the computer when they try to evaluate how they could behave more efficiently in-game. Repeating the same calculation processes over and over and over again like the processor of the computer. They have adopted the computer's condition, one might say. Introducing ever more achievements, the computer game continuously offers new reasons to continue calculating and evaluating during idle times. me, this is sort of reminiscent of what Frida Nake names the own aesthetics of digital media, that is the aesthetics of incompleteness, which derives from computers performing the same operation indefinitely. Even a game like No Man's Sky, which is advertised as offering experience of infinite freedom, may eventually just allow the infinite freedom of doing more of the same over and over again. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Sebastian. And I'm sorry to our streaming audience about the sound quality. I think, as we said in the brief interruption when Sebastian's sound seemed to have actually improved, I think it's to do with upload speeds on the Berlin end, is my guess. But when I re-edit these videos and upload them, any dodgy audio, we might do a pre-record to make sure that you don't have to suffer through bad audio more than once. Okay, so it seems like most of the comments in the YouTube stream so far have been about our sound wrangling. So I'd like to move on to our final speaker, Trevor, and hopefully moving through these discussions of representation and what game objects are to what we do with them and how the patterns of how game objects are used adds another level of meaning to play as a repetitive behavior. And I guess, as Sebastian was saying, the emulation of computational behavior by the player. So, enough rambling, Peter. Trevor, I'm going to clean up. I'll clean up the server again for you, and hopefully we've got a nice clean sound connection for you.
Yeah, can everyone hear me okay? I can move the mic or turn it up.
I can hear.
Right?
I can hear you fine.
Wonderful.
So yeah, let's hope that this sets the tone for.
I wanted to apologize to you. I noticed everyone else sent you their material early, and I totally did not do that. So I am sorry. It's all just veiled threats and profanity. So I was worried you wouldn't let me do it.
Well, I'm happier to be surprised then. And maybe another thing for sound. Perhaps people could mute their microphones. I wonder if there's any ambient sound that might be, I don't know if that could be doing some weird rebalancing stuff. So could everybody who's not speaking turn down your microphones or something at your end? Maybe that might give us a better chance of hearing Trevor's talk uninterrupted. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Trevor Strunk, who is going to give the final talk for Seminar 1 on game objects and representation. Welcome, Trevor.
Hi. So my name is Trevor Strunk. I guess my academic credential is that I'm a lecturer at DeSales University in Center Valley, Pennsylvania, although more recently just in the internet, Pennsylvania. I got my PhD from University of Illinois Chicago, which might explain some of the focus on intentionality in my work if you know that department. And mostly what I do now is I have a podcast called No Cartridge that deals with sort of games analysis. So today I'm going to be drawing on an article I wrote a little while back called Alone in a World of Objects, which was published in nonsite.org. As well as some of my other thinking recently about gaming and Espen Arseth's cybertext. So any questions about any of that, please just let me know. I'm happy to expand on any of it. All right. A couple of years ago, I wrote an article for the wonderful journal nonsite.org called Alone in a World of Objects. This article had actually something of a long tail in its publication. It was under consideration in a number of other journals before finding a home. Big part of the reason for this was that I wrote the piece as part of a larger rejection of gaming criticism and what was, at that point, being called digital humanities. As a result, I was perhaps a bit less understanding than I should have been, and I fell a bit into polemic as a result. What got me so angry, you're probably asking, and I will say with the respect of hindsight, probably unreasonably angry. To put it bluntly, I was frustrated and, yes, angry with the discipline's combination of inability and disinterest in reading video games as text. While ludonarrative dissonance has been explored enough to go from promising subject of study to shorthand for jargon, all the way back to promising subject of study, the study of games in the academy never seems to be able to get past the stigma of its subject and dwells on the external, extra-formal elements of the text. The questions of how video games can help us understand textuality or how video games can represent new spaces for discourse occupy the field far more than deliberate analysis, close reading or otherwise, of games and, here's the topic, the objects therein. Let me clarify a bit with what I'm talking about with a quote from Espen Arseth's Cybertext, followed by a small excerpt from my own analysis of Gone Home and the Talos Principle from my aforementioned article. First, here's Arseth, and this is from his first manuscript, Cybertext, on the difficulty of getting literary critics to follow along with his theories of reading and play. And as an aside, I wish more conferences could have me floating in the air. That would be cool. Hypertexts, adventure games, and so forth, this is Arseth, are not text in the way average literary work is a text. In what way, then, are they texts? They produce verbal structures for aesthetic effect. This makes them similar to other literary phenomena, but they are also something more, and it is this added paraverbal dimension that is so hard to see. Now, this term paraverbal, I think, is really important. A cybertext is a machine for the production of variety of expression. Since literary theorists are trained to uncover literary ambivalence in texts with linear expression, they evidently mistook, literary theorists that is, texts with variable expression for texts with ambiguous meaning. The problem was that, while they focused on what was being read, I, that is Espen Arseth, focused on what was being read from. So Arseth is concerned with the object of analysis itself, as he says, what is the meaning being read from, or what are we reading from? As the form itself enables the aporia needed for his ergodic reading practice. And Arseth goes more into the term ergodic reading practice. I didn't want to spend 30 minutes here, but it's actually a very interesting and nuanced term. Again, Cybertext has a lot in there. Worth reading if you're not already ensconced in gaming crit. As a result, the ambiguity for Arseth has less to do with the meaning of the text and more to do with its form. While we should give Arseth, of all people, the grace to assume he recognizes the dialectic between those two terms, it's also clear from the way he describes these texts as machines that if form dialectically interacts with content at all, it is to produce a resolution where the latter has meaning, the latter being content, has meaning apart from the banality of quote-unquote simple ambiguity. Compare this approach to this excerpt from, forgive me, my article. Gone Home forwards a progressive social politics through the medium of nostalgia. I'm speaking here of the classic walking simulator by the Fulbright Company, Gone Home. But in the final moments of the game, where the player can be said to be in closest communion with the code of the game's graphics engine, the focus of the piece shifts from it's an exploration of an empty house. You discover that your sister is gone, and you try and work out why. The reason you discover is that she has run off with her lover, another girl, because their parents don't understand. It's set in 1995. However, at the end of the game, when you're just left in the house alone with all the stuff in front of you, the focus of the piece shifts to an unresponsive set of commodities, much actually like Gary's mod. Movable but without significance, blank and reduced to their constitutive atoms, past politics, past even use and exchange value. In the Talos Principle, sort of a Portal-like game dealing with a god figure, an individualist ending undercuts a politics of absorptive aesthetics. But the cycle of the game represents a kind of frustrated purgatory, repetition without material reward. Talos' self-reflexivity represents a critical inward gaze that rejects the significance of the video game grind toward collection, while continuing to embody its wholly to embody that grind wholly in its own grinding and puzzle solving. The detail of the stray object, the video game glitch, or the boundary recalls the players from their limitless visual fantasy and reminds them that this is a fantasy. Oh, sorry about the spoilers, everyone. To Gone Home, I assumed people had been playing it. Just play the game anyway, it's neat. These formal limits open the space for critique, however provisional at our historic moment, and call attention to the ways in which the world of objects and things is unfulfilling as an imminently aesthetic expression. So, to get back to non-quotes, the difference between Arseth's occupation with games in mind, therefore, is the difference between a hyperformal analysis concerned with the study of language and communication, that would be Arseth, versus a study of the game as a literary aesthetic object, subject to the same medium-specific constraints of any other genre of literary media. That's mine. And to finally come to the topic of this panel fully, I think the difference between those two stances must absolutely come down to how one views the objects themselves in video games. Are these objects traces in the Derridian sense of coded language, or are they more typical representations of objects, mimetic or otherwise? Certainly, Arseth is not wrong in viewing objects in video games as those linguistic signs made visual, as all games consist of complicated coding that at its core can be reduced to language of a sort. But I think the objects within games themselves complicate this reduction of game aesthetic to simple signifier. Take the MMORPG genre, for instance. In Final Fantasy XIV, my MMO preoccupation of choice, you can farm, absolutely going back to the previous, Sebastian's previous presentation here, you can farm or persistently search, fight, queue up for items, as one can in any MMO. And like any MMO, these items can either be used by the player for decoration for their in-game home, rare armor and weapons, or even mounts, things you ride on, or minions, things that follow you around. Right now, my character has a cute little giraffe following him around, something I farmed for to spice up the in-game appearance of the player, or, unless you want to sell, if you don't want to sell it, they can be sold. And often items that have limited ostensible value, but heightened rarity can, as any economist will tell you, produce prices far outstripping their presumed value. Thus, the rarely dropped item that gives players new haircuts might, in the world of the game itself, be worth almost nil to many players who don't care about haircuts, but in the world of the marketplace, be worth millions and millions of dollars to those who do. Or, well, millions and millions of gil. Even accepting the gray market of gil for money sales that exists in Final Fantasy XIV, despite the best efforts of Square Enix Corporation, we have a fairly common Marxist analog appear. One can put labor into the game to get items that give them use value or exchange value. And ultimately, since the labor time is effectively owned by the player herself, the exploitation of the player's time is not particularly at issue, although I think Sebastian helpfully complicated that assertion I have there. So we are left with a fascinating oscillation for each and every item. Does this item represent an object you'll be using in-game, or does it represent money? Are objects material-esque building blocks of the game experience, or are they stand-ins for capital? This kind of ambiguity is social, and above all, a kind of reading that cannot be understood linguistically, but must be understood through the aestheticization of the economic. To be a bit careless and blunt about it, Final Fantasy XIV's market board has more to do with the aestheticization of money in William Gaddis's JR than it does linguistic aporia. And I suppose this is why I want to take a step beyond, or perhaps better, in a different direction than Arseth. I should be clear, of course, I very much like Arseth's work and find cybertext in particular to be one of the more engaging theoretical looks at games criticism. It's seminal for a reason. But to lean on Arseth without complicating his foundational ideas is to produce criticism that lags behind the aesthetic product in terms of its sophistication. Recently, I had the opportunity to review for Electronics Gaming Monthly Half-Life Alyx, a virtual reality sequel nearly 2 decades later of Half-Life 2, which is the game that spawned our current surroundings in Gary's mod. The upshot of my review was that the game, Half-Life Alyx, was spectacularly engaging. Universal Studios ride on tracks that satisfied my lizard brain a lot, but wasn't particularly path-breaking in terms of narrative or aesthetics, outside of a few standout final scenes. I won't go into them here, but pretty neat sort of like penultimate moments in Half-Life Alyx. My one complaint about the then massively popular conclusion that Alyx had changed video games forever was that while the game certainly produced a type of immersion for the player, it also suffered from the fact that if you strayed too far while playing with your VR headset on, the smooth reloading of a pistol, which was actually kind of fun, you could use your hands and kind of do it manually and all, the smooth reloading of a pistol became a painful whack of your hand against a desk or a flung microphone. In short, Alyx did not somehow ontologically change the representative object into a real object simply by changing the format of the game. And similarly, we may say that Arseth does not turn representation on its ear entirely simply by shifting the game's space's ambiguity and varied expression onto the player's choices instead of finding them where I'd argue they belong, in the game's choices as a text. In other words, Arseth is absolutely correct that literary critics simply focus on what is being read, but he, unlike me, views this as a negative characteristic, or at least an unproductive one. For games, like novels, understand the epistemological constraints of representation. Platonic as we remain despite our best efforts, ideal objects are, generally speaking, acknowledged as representative but not material. The green light in Gatsby is not a real green light. The super shotgun in Doom is not a real shotgun. As a result, objects are the most consistent link between traditional texts and video games. We know what they are and simply read them. The process of signification is identical, and therefore, we do not have an epistemological or linguistic problem on our hands when we have to distinguish games from literary texts, but instead an aesthetic one. What are the objects around us in games, and what do they mean? Why are they here, and what intentions did the developers have in including them? These questions decenter the player, of course, but require the player to unlock their potential as a reader as well. I would suggest not getting rid of the reader at all then, which it might seem I'm trying to do. And certainly the stigma of intentionalism is to suggest we want to get rid of the reader. But whatever intentionalism I have, it's not that kind. I would suggest not getting rid of the reader at all then, but to recenter the game and finally agree that a video game is a text, no less than a novel or poem. Our goal, not simple in the end, is to simply read the objects around us. And that's all for me.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks so much for that, Trevor. I did my best to find you a peaceful place to sit, but
that was thank you. I appreciate that under the bridge.
Yeah, but
also,
yes,
I'm happy to share the text if you want it, if you're posting it somewhere, Peter. Just let me know.
That's really generous of you. Thanks so much. As I said, I'm hoping that the somewhat disorganized / chaotic nature of this first session will be followed up by some more tightly edited, informative video content. So if we could do something with the text, maybe you reading it out, or I can link to it wherever you post it. That'll be excellent.
Of course.
Okay, so it's getting late here, but I thought there are a few little tidbits that I wouldn't mind following up with in conversation. Perhaps there was something that I was reminded of, Trevor, in one of the last things you were saying. It sort of reminded me of why I became interested in studying games in the first place. I sort of have a background in art school more than literary theory or media studies or anything like that. And one of the things that sort of reminds me of painting in games is that it's very hard to have an accidental object in a painting, unless it's sort of a surrealist process where the paint might bring out objects by mistake. Unlike a film where what happens in the background might be a packet of chips there that could be incidental. In both a game and a painting, and also any text such as a poem or a written work, everything has a degree of sort of deliberation. So I was wondering, perhaps between Sebastian and Trevor, how do you sort of think of this idea of incidental objects in the games that you study relative to sort of the meanings of either work or the sort of incidental storytelling that these objects might do, given that we can't pretend that anything is there by mistake.
Sebastian, do you want to go first?
Oh, please go ahead. It's
okay.
Right. I will see what you say.
Oh, sure. So, I have two answers off the top of my head. The one would be something like in Gone Home. And again, sorry, I noticed in Discord chat that people were upset about spoilers. I always assume that people have played the games, that I'm the last to get to them, but that's maybe not fair. But the scene I'm describing, and I describe it much more in the article at Nonsite. So if you're interested, I would definitely recommend you check that out. Is this last scene where basically if you beat the game, you have access to the house without any of the plot, so you can kind of mess around. The game lets you mess around with all these videotapes your dad has, or whatever, right? Like it's a 1990s house. If you lived in the 90s, it's very nostalgic and fun. But all of the objects start to feel incidental because they're stripped of their signification, right? So, like, unlike a painting, which can't be recontextualized unless in very like specific situations, like directly after it's done, right? Gone Home is legitimately decontextualized in this like free-for-all mode, since that's not how the game was played. And in the free-for-all mode, every object feels intentional since none of them are important. So I think that's one way you can do it. The other way I would say is in games like, Gary's Mod's a good example, or as much as I really like Final Fantasy XIV for this, I think maybe the best example is something like GTA Online, which, unlike most Grand Theft Auto games where like cars and things are placed for you, and you're supposed to get them and use them when more or less linearly, people can appear in GTA Online and just spawn Lamborghinis for you, or piles of money, or something like that. And it becomes much more, to sort of draw from some previous talks. It draws much more on sort of like situationalist thinking, where like all of a sudden the money appearing in the middle of the road, it's not exactly incidental, but it is certainly deterritorialized in an interesting way, such that like someone handing out stacks of $1,000 bills feels somewhat normal in a way that, certainly in the real world, but even in Grand Theft Auto, it would not.
Okay. Yes, Sebastian, do you want to chime in on this same point?
I'm wondering what I can say. I'm so much into this No Man's Sky kind of thing that I'm so much focusing on this grinding activities that I find there's nothing incidental there. It's all like everything is like part of an economical logic, if you want so much. So everything that is sort of mineable can be used to some extent. So I'm not sure if this is like for or against the argument that these objects could be incidental or not.
Sebastian, can I ask you something?
Go ahead, please.
Is there? So I've played a little bit of No Man's Sky, not enough to really speak to it as you have, but isn't No Man's Sky, at least in some respects, procedurally generated? Like the worlds themselves are somewhat So do you think there's something? How do you think about intentionality as you're sort of describing it alongside procedural generation? Because it would seem to me that those two, and maybe not, but it would seem to me that those two ideas are sort of opposed to each other.
There's I don't think so. I think intentionality happens on a different level. Intentionality is not part of placing an object exactly where it's supposed to be in order to fulfill some in-game goal. Mm-hmm. Intentionality lies in the way how this procedurality is being structured, right? So it's not. Or let's take it over to Minecraft. Maybe that's simpler. Intentionality does not lie in there's a tree placed for a reason, but it is part of the logics that's part of the biome, which spawns a certain world, if you know what I mean. So it says like this part of the world is supposed to look like this and this and this. It's never, so it's giving sort of some leeway. It's possible to spawn, but there is some intentionality that definitely finds ahead of time the leeway in sort of objects can spawn somewhere and whatnot. That's what I would say.
Sort of like the intention of an like an ecological intention, sort of like as a space, as opposed to like within its individual iterations.
Might I chime in on this topic of intentionality in computer games as software? I mean, whose intentionality? Is it the whoever created the libraries, who created the engine? There's like layers upon layers of sort of realms in which we might trace these intentionalities to. So it seems to me that it sort of questions the whole concept of intentionality in the context of computer games. Is a non-intention an intention? Is a bug? Can we distinguish between a bug and a feature in the game? And how do we draw the line between intentions in terms of functionality, intentions in terms of meaning of the game? Something doesn't work, something doesn't make sense.
Olli,
Are these different scenarios?
yeah, there's one thing, I don't know if this is relevant, but when Eder and I were playing around with Gary's mod this afternoon, doing all the technical tests that we thought would save us from disaster, there's an odd bug in the chairs that I'm sitting in. The reason we started playing with these chairs, if you can see where I am on the platform in these two leather chairs, we have the chair that can be sat in versus the chair that cannot be sat in. One is just according to how the Valve source engine works, this one is probably destructible and give off certain animations. This one is coded such that it can be sat in. But the other strange thing is that when I'm sitting in this chair, I'm pretty sure my character is invincible. And I think the reasoning I could work out for that is that most of the chair objects come from how vehicles are coded in the Valve source engine, because I'm pretty sure in most Valve source engine games, the only things you can sit on are vehicle chairs. And when you're in a vehicle, I don't think you can be injured. I think it's something like that. But of course here, it's complete nonsense, that the two chairs look exactly the same. And what we're seeing here is, I can't imagine it was an intentionality on the part of Gary Newman. And so you see, you just destroyed the other chair. But I think it's kind of a combination of pragmatism in how the engine was built and what can be changed in it. We have this vehicle chair, so we can swap the model for another chair. But then with this, I guess, completely unintentional absurdity that it's this, chair is the ultimate kind of protective zone in the game, that I guess if I wanted to stop being blown up before, I probably should have just sat down. So in terms of like procedurality and intention, and even in No Man's Sky, there must be sorting mechanisms, surely, that say this thing is a resource that can be mined, that has some sort of potential value, whereas this thing isn't. And I was wondering, Sebastian, have you encountered any areas like that do sort of, I don't know, have category crossovers or things that don't fit so easily into categories of significant, insignificant objects, etc., etc.?
Not sure if I have really looked at him from, or maybe no. Maybe this is actually saying more about my own way of playing the game than it is revealing any truth about the game. But I'm so much to play for efficiency. I'm looking at everything from this angle. So everything. I'm apparently only dealing with objects that can be used some a goal or something like that. I'm not sure if I've really seen objects of this kind which are between two categories.
It reminds me a little bit, like all of these questions all kind of, so to speak to what Sebastian was just saying, it reminds me of the distinction between a casual and power gamer, which comes up a lot in these sort of like massive games, and the multiplayer in No Man's Sky has been one of its central sort of complications the whole time. So I don't know if it's right to call it a massive multiplayer online RPG or whatever, but like the idea of what appeals to a casual player, like there's probably a casual player of No Man's Sky who just likes finding the prettier flowers on a planet, or the sort of like more attractive rocks, or likes looking at vistas, right? And then there's gamers, pardon me if this carries a kind of stigma, but it's a stigma I share with you, like power gamers like Sebastian who like mine for efficiency and sort of like think about like, okay, how am I going to make this like a perfect kind of like streamlined approach? And to me, that feels like a difference in reception, in much the same way that like a bug and even sort of like thinking about the chair modeling, right? Like these are sort of like ambiguities in language, if you want to think about it that way, where like the tools in which we use to create our games, and which is to say source, occupy the same space as like the English language on a smaller scale, or the German language or the Spanish language or whatever on a smaller scale. And, you know, Gary Newman probably did not intend that one thing to mean another thing, but in another sense, like it reminds me of when my children's choir I was in went to England, and we were told not to call our the things we put around our waist, we were told to call them bum bags instead of fanny packs, and none of us knew why until they told us, and we all started sniggering because we were 14-year-old boys and girls. I mean, that's the same thing, right? Unintentional entirely, but a kind of ambiguity that one needs to address.
Okay, so I'm just reading through a few comments. I think we've mainly got comments in the YouTube stream. We have a comment that someone really likes the linking of grinding to neoliberal fantasy in Sebastian's talk, and it's reminiscent of Lauren Berlant's notion of cruel optimism as a reference, I suppose. And it looks like a question has just popped in from Richard that says, couldn't we say that glitches can be considered as these in-between objects between intentionality and non-intentionality, like rocket jumping, crate surfing, etc.?
It's clever.
Say yes. For the moment they appear. At some point they will become normal objects or actions. Because at some point, if it is possible to repeat, they are not real glitches, bugs, and you can exploit them for some in-game behavior. They just become is considered normal gameplay.
I wonder.
When they change status. So the rocket jumping, for instance, a great example, which occurred just as some sort of glitch, and then it became way hard.
I think as close as we can get to what Thomas Malaby was talking about when he was saying that games constantly refigure themselves. I think when the glitch becomes a part of the accepted practice, that would be an example of computer games doing what Malaby saw games as doing, refiguring themselves.
I'd like to ask Eder, actually, with your research on the representation or simulation, representation by means of simulation, something like a glitch where a game, especially in a competitive game where a glitch can have a huge advantage, and I guess the developers have to decide whether to get rid of it or leave it in, I guess, according to what the player base will tolerate or will enjoy. In terms of representation by simulation, how would you consider something like a glitch? Is it if you are describing representation in this way, then can you absorb a glitch into this sort of description?
I think one would have to, I suppose. Depending on, where we look. If we look at simulations from the point of view of the developers, no, but that is not really what I've been doing. I've been looking on it from the point of view of the player. And in that regard, we would have to consider it part of the simulation, I suppose.
Okay, so the simulation is simply is more an emergent property than an authored property. So in that case, like a rocket launcher can be considered a ladder if it can be used as a ladder, and a chair can be considered as I guess a god mode, temporary god mode, because it's used in that way.
Well, yes, I would say so. I don't want to say that it's that simulations are necessarily emerging. Like this is the point of view, or the. I'm mostly interested in the point of view of the players, but of course, game developers needs to operate with some kind of model of what it is that they are designing. But from the point of view of the player, I would find it difficult to claim that it would be possible for the player to really disregard the glitch as part of the material. Like, how would we make that distinction?
Yeah, we just had a comment actually from Silver Laser on the YouTube chat that Celeste is a game where there are enough quirks in the physics engine that were discovered by developers and players that that then were sort of made official and taught to you in later levels, as opposed
That's
to
a great answer.
Just mechanics that are taught outside of the game. Like, I guess, and he also points out speedrunning as a classic, as another good example. To take advantage, before we all run out of steam, to take advantage of some of our guests, I was wondering, Espen, if you have voice connected, was there anything you wanted to reply, particularly in terms of some references to a bunch of your papers and this notion of games as texts and so on?
I don't know. It's a good question. To me, of course, it's always about the connection between the text and the mechanics, and that's where the whole problem lies. That it is not either or, but it's the combination that makes these things, if they are interesting. And then, of course, many things are not interesting in that combination, and they might be interesting in other ways. But I'm not sure if I should comment on particulars because it's such a complex conversation to have.
Espen, I wonder, and I know it's kind of rude of me to ask since I used your work as a jumping off point for critique, so I hope that was taken as collegial. I wonder, have you played or seen anything, and this can actually be for anyone here, I think it's a fascinating game for this particular crowd to think about. Have any of you played Baba Is You? You have any experience with this game?
Sure.
Yeah, so I was wondering what you thought about Baba Is You, this game that sort of like relies upon language, but also language as puzzle solving function, but also requires you to kind of use language in ways that could never really be seen as intentional in like normal speech. So to explain to anyone who hasn't played it, it's basically a puzzle game where if you have a thing that says Baba is you, you can take away the Baba part and make it chair is you, and then you're the chair as opposed to the little bunny who's Baba, and you have to solve puzzles.
Well, it's a brilliant game. I mean, that's what it is, and it's also a meta game, and it's perhaps one of those few games that are both meta game and game at the same time. I mean, if you take, for instance, the Stanley Parable, I would say that's not really a game as much as a meta game, but Baba Is You is in a certain sense both, and in a more impressive way, I think, than most games that try to be both.
Mm-hmm. So how do you see the mechanics and the sort of meaning intersecting there at all? I mean, I don't know if you don't have any thought on that, that's okay. I sort of sprung it on you, but that seems like a super fascinating case study for that.
Yeah. I don't have any sort of special insights into that game.
Okay, no, that's fine.
I haven't played it that much. I've basically just watched playthroughs mostly. So I haven't spent more than maybe 20 minutes looking at it at all. But it seems to me like it's the perfect combination of a game that tries to be more than a game, but also is a super interesting game in its own right.
Mm.
So, I mean, for me, it's when we say game, we need to be very careful about what we're talking about. Are we talking about something which is clearly an amalgam of lots of different media structures and media types of content? Or are we talking about something which can be played independent of its material users or objects or mechanisms? And then we are basically using the same word in two very, very different ways. And that is much of, or if not most, much of the cause of misunderstandings in our field.
It's interesting.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, of course.
So, you mentioned metagame. What is a metagame to you, and is Garry's Mod a metagame?
Garry's Mod is probably a metagame. It's probably not a game at all. It is something that is using game technologies to be its own thing. And I mean, it's no more a game than a playground is a game.
But your metagame concept can encompass both things, Stanley Parable.
A metagame to me, I mean, metagame is also just a word. All these things that we are using are just words, and they can mean so many different things, as you know. So a metagame to me, I mean, the most interesting way of using that word for me is something that comments on what a game is. And there can be so many other ways of using the word metagame, obviously.
Actually, speaking of metagame, we do have in the final seminar 4, we have Stephanie Bollock and Patrick Lemieux, who wrote a book by that title, and I'm sure we will have a discussion over debating the use of the word. I mean, one of the things I said at the top that perhaps to go to Espen's point of Garry's Mod as a playground, I also view Garry's Mod as also something a little bit like just a piece of creative software, like Photoshop or a particularly constrained version where we're not we don't have access to every pixel, but it somewhere between creative software and playground. Will be seminar 3. We'll be talking about playgrounds just to I guess promote the other seminars. But yeah, I just wanted to chime in with the Garry's Mod as creative software, a la slightly odd version of Photoshop. But instead of brushes, we have game props. Okay, are there any other questions from the panelists or the guests on the Discord? If that's a no, then I might call time, because it's getting reasonably late at night here in our time zone. And I want to thank everybody on the live stream for tuning in for so long, and all the panelists for joining in the first session, and for indulging this sort of pet project that I've been wanting to do for quite a while. Hopefully the next session, which is this time tomorrow, will be graced with fewer technical glitches, and our sound will be cleaner, and we'll all be more professional in general. But thank you all so much for joining in every time zones that you're in, and I hope you're all very well, and I hope to see as many of you as are able this time tomorrow.
Thank you,
Peter.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Great meeting you guys. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, you too.
Bye.